Welcome to the SAHMA Exchange, a podcast where policy, people, and property management meet. Today's episode, we're tackling a critical question facing the affordable housing industry right now. What happens if we stop advocating? If affordable housing professionals aren't telling the story of this industry, someone else will. And when policymakers, communities, and the public lose connection to the operational realities happening at properties, the consequences can affect funding, regulations, public perception, and ultimately the residents. Joining us today are two leaders bringing both the national advocacy perspective and the frontline operational perspective to this conversation. We're joined by Larry Keyes, Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Affordable Housing Management Association, aka NAHMA, and Glenda Leduc, President of Mansermar Inc. and Mid-America Apartment Management Company Inc. We're going to discuss all of these advocacy matters and how public stigma impacts the future of affordable housing, why lawmakers need operational voices from the field, and what's at stake if we stop talking. Welcome to the podcast, Larry and Glenda. I'm so glad you're here.
Happy to be here.
Happy to be here. It's a privilege.
Before we talked about why advocacy matters, I wanted to talk about what's actually at stake. So I wanted to talk to Larry because he spends his days tracking legislation, engaging with policymakers, and representing the interests of affordable housing professionals nationwide. So I asked him, what are the biggest threats or pressures affordable housing is facing right now from a policy standpoint?
Yeah, it's a really great question and probably very timely. I would say it's a few directions that we're getting really hit from, but I'll touch upon a few, just kind of set the framework. There's the funding challenge that's always constant. So that's the annual appropriations, and we're kind of in the appropriation season, one midway through one, and then we're setting up the tables for FY27, which starts October 1. So there's the funding challenge, and I'll get in more details about the nature of that challenge. And then there's always the supply challenge. We don't have enough supply to meet the tenants that we serve. That's why we have the waiting list and length of time that we have associated with those. So there's always the supply challenge, and that's really grappled the attention of the country and really lawmakers right now. It's a big piece of legislation working its way through Congress that I'm pretty sure I'm going to cover over the course of our conversation. But then there is also, and then if let's just say we get those first two, then there's a preservation challenge, and that's just keeping what we got, maintaining the operational needs to preserve the units and keep them operating, keep the properties operating in a sustainable manner, both financially and physically. And if we can solve those three, I like to go there. There's the good life outcome challenge, and we're not seeing enough resources dedicated to supportive services or those tools and programs needed to empower tenants, whether you're talking about self-sufficiency and economic empowerment, job training for the current job moment in the labor market. So those are the big high ones, and there's a whole bunch that's going on underneath all of those. But I think that's a good framework to be.
So congratulations, Larry. You just made all of our heads spin to start us off. So I really appreciate that. Larry outlined some significant challenges from funding pressures and housing supply issues to preserving existing affordable housing and ensuring positive outcomes for residents. All of those we probably feel every day. None of those challenges solve themselves, and many of them depend on decisions being made by lawmakers and policymakers. So I wanted to narrow in on one in particular and get Larry's thoughts on that and what's going on in DC. Let's talk to Larry a little bit more about the housing supply issue.
Yeah, so supply is really, I think it's having its good 2-year run, and it's building off the last. I really think that it grappled with the tension around the pandemic. We really saw when everybody returned home and was working from home, we really saw the supply challenge come into focus, just where the broader housing market was and really frozen in time, for lack of a better word. But the supply challenge, if you pull back, I think most national estimates, depending on where you're looking at it into the housing market, whether rental or home ownership, talking about somewhere between 5 and 7 million units that we don't have on the market that we need right now. And that's not to keep pace with the population that's growing. But yeah, so that's really grabbed attention, I think, coming out the last election and really to today in the state of the economy. It's really had the attention of both the White House and Congress, and they have a pretty big comprehensive bill. It's called the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. ROAD is Renewing Opportunity in the American Dream. So I'm going to just use road for here on out. I'm not going to say all of that again.
We
That's
love
about
our acronyms, don't we, in this
they
industry?
love acronyms. And my joke is there's someone in DC at a bar just creating these acronyms because you can only do them at the drinks. Like it's just, they're just having fun with it. But we get it and we have to work with it. But yeah, so the Road Act has about 40 bills. It's bipartisan and it's passed both chambers twice. And we're still trying to get it across the finish line. And it really just, most people don't know that the Housing Act that governs our country really dates back to really the Great Depression era, talking about 1937, but it's been updated probably every 10 to 20 years. We really haven't had a significant update since 1992. And this is what this bill is trying to do. So we've largely done a lot of this, and we'll talk about the conversations through regulation, through notices, things like that. But a lot of lessons learned that we don't have legal authority, and that's what's important to get the law passed. So we have the modern framework to really, be innovative and continue to innovative things that members like Glenda do. So that bill's working its way through Congress. If we go back just a year ago, the biggest significant boost that we've had came through the tax reform package, and that was President Trump signature domestic policy agenda. It's called the One Big Beautiful Bill, but it had it expanded LIHTC. We're looking at, hopefully, if things hold current, estimates are we're going to have about 1.2 million units either newly developed or preserved over the next decade. And that was the largest expansion of the low-income housing tax credit. And that's largely of the work that members do to make that program successful. And it's the most bipartisan housing production tool that we have in the toolbox, and it's supported by lawmakers on both political sides. So it's very popular, and we got that expanded, and hopefully we can do more on get more units or at least preserve the supply. So those big two are really what been getting my attention on the legislative side. Again, when we think about the funding situation, we often, we rely annually on appropriations. We had a good appropriations bill this past year, despite some recommended cuts from the administration, but we think we're going to be in a good place next year, but a lot of it's going to tell after the election's over. But pause there, we're in a good place, so that's been keeping me busy.
Larry mentioned the 21st Century Road to Housing Act as one example of legislation that could help address some of the housing supply challenges, some of the funding challenges, some of the preservation challenges. But bills like that don't move forward on good ideas alone. They require support, education, and engagement from the people who understand affordable housing best. So I wondered, are lawmakers hearing from affordable housing professionals enough right now to help get legislation like this across the finish line?
Yeah, so it's for me in my world, it's never enough. So I'm like the perfectionist. So it's just, you go again, like I'm the ultimate, it's like, Alabama winning or Georgia. Let me be friendly to those who won national championships recently in football. Like there's a system. They go again the next year. Like they're not sitting on the national title. So that's kind of what my position is. But the work that has gotten to this point has been a testament of our industry. And these bills are really, and you're talking about 6 to 8 years of just continuous work to even get to this point. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes that to get to the moment. And but we have to continue it because again, this is really things we're already doing. And as the committee members or you hear lawmakers say, this is just like the groundwork. This is setting up for what we want to do down the road. So the work is always ongoing. And obviously things in our country change. So the market changes, the political outcomes of election change. So you always have the musical chairs, and so you always have to be vocal. But I would say it met its moment. We have to continue to meet the moment. But we're probably going to have a little bit of work here to do between now and the election to get it over the finish line. So that's kind of where my focus is, and probably I'll be directing members to galvanize or reach out to their lawmakers.
Larry made the case that there's still a lot of work to do to educate lawmakers and build support for these policies. But ultimately, these conversations don't just affect Washington. They affect what happens at properties every single day. So I wanted to bring Glenda into the conversation. As someone responsible for managing affordable housing communities and serving residents, I wanted to know what she's feeling from these policy conversations on an operational level.
The thing is there's been great movement. And as Larry said, I think we're at a pivotal time in our industry where affordable housing is really at the national level and on both sides of Congress, regardless, the president, the Senate. I mean, everybody is interested because there is no question that we need more affordable housing. We've had great success, as Larry mentioned, from the expansion and reform of the LIHTC with the bond financing thresholds. People are now looking at workforce housing incentives and things that we need. But the problem is while a lot of these things are great and focused from the development side, which, I kind of work in both the development side and the property management side, is our policy pressures are really being felt on the property management side, more so probably than forever. They're creating these conversations, which are policy and you've got to deal with. They create rising issues as far as more compliance requirements that are added to all these funding programs. It's great, and we're excited that we have funding programs, but it is more and more complex to do that. You look at rent limits, and people are saying, okay, this is how we do it from a policy perspective, and they're trying to limit it, but not looking at the increasing pressures of the expense increases and how that impacts you from an operating standpoint. There's more reporting that's required with all these regulations that are added. So great, but it's not one thing. More inspection. It's not at one level. Everybody has theirs. And so there's more regulatory audits that are involved. You're concerned on one hand, as Larry said, with tenant protections. But other hand, what do you do with evictions and the leasing processes and making sure you're maintaining it appropriately for all residents, not just some residents? So a lot of this debate is going on in Washington, but it impacts directly the day-to-day operations at the property level and the things that we have to deal with.
Glenda highlighted something that often gets overlooked, that building affordable housing is only part of the equation. Managing it successfully is an entirely different challenge. So I wanted to know what happens when a regulation makes sense on paper, but the realities on the ground are much more complicated. How does Glenda and her teams navigate these situations?
They are often disconnected, and it is not easy to work through those. You're trying, the policies are often assumed that you've got stable costs where your operations are not. You've got rapid insurance increases, you've got inflation-driven expenses, you've got capital cost spikes, you've got to deal with, like I said, the rent restrictions versus the sustainability. So while your regulations are focused on the rent growth and what operators can actually do, it's not sufficiently impacting the rising operating costs that you're dealing with, or an unexpected financial, impact of something that happened. You had, a climate change, and you had freezing, and so you had a sprinkler system that burst, and so all of a sudden that wasn't in your budget or your capital item because it wasn't of the length time, but you've got to go in and make those repairs. And because insurance costs increase, you've had to increase your deductible and look at those kind of things, which all directly impact property operations. So you're constantly dealing with those changes as far as your budget and where do you come in with those cuts, and compliance versus capacity. There are more compliance requirements, but you can't increase your staff to handle those because you've got the restrictions on your staffing costs and those expenses. And just even your staffing costs aren't just the cost of salaries, it's your insurance, it's your benefits, because you're competing with others out there and other industries that can pay more, to be honest, and can offer more benefits. And so we need increased ability from our staff, and we're asking them to give more, but yet we don't have the financing structure, because when you're trying to make those deals work and pencil from the development side, you got to cut your cost. And this is what your per unit cost has got to be across the line. So you got to determine, how do we support this? How do we get the funding that we need? As Larry said, we've got increased funding, but a part of that funding means you got debt service coverage ratios that you got to keep. And that means that if you've got rent restrictions, you got to have those expenses at a certain level. And so they just don't keep pace. And so oftentimes your development prioritize too building new units, as Larry said. But a key thing is we've got preservation that's necessary. So how do we keep those preservation and the operation of those existing affordable housing units so that they're staying at the level they need to from a perspective that you really want these to be quality communities. Affordable housing does not mean that they are not quality communities. And so how do you achieve that with your operating cost and your capital cost to make sure you're not getting into deferred maintenance or, some of those kind of rules? And oftentimes as well, you're dealing with federal regulation versus your local regulations, and those differ. And so you've got two conflicting regulations at a property level that you've got to deal with. You're going to deal with those that are most restrictive, but oftentimes the two don't line up. And so how do you deal with that and make that come into alignment from an operational perspective?
Well, that just doesn't make sense. Like when I sit here and talk to somebody,
welcome to affordable housing.
Glenda just painted a picture for us of just how complex this can become when operational realities, federal regulations, and state regulations are all pulling in different directions. So I wanted to ask her a direct question. Does she think the folks in Washington, D.C. fully understand what these decisions look like once they reach a property and the teams responsible for carrying them out? Do you think they do?
No, I don't. I think that and it comes back to part of what Larry said. So that's the need for the advocacy. They're dealing with it and hear a lot of voices, quite honestly, from, there's a lot of tenant advocates that are out there. And we really are some of the biggest tenant advocates, but you can't advocate for just that. You've got to have responsible policies and responsible regulations for those residents and for the operators, so that are there good residents out there? Absolutely. Are there bad residents out there? Absolutely. Are there good operators out there? Absolutely. Are there bad operators? Absolutely. So you've got to have policy that you're looking at that really is meeting not just how do we get the units on the ground, but is dealing with how do we get the units on the ground? How do we keep them? How do we preserve them? And how do we operate them in a manner that truly does provide, and what we say is quality affordable housing, not just affordable housing, but that is a testament to what policy wants and what the Congress is looking at, but a testament to what the residents want and the operators want too. That is a place that your residents want to live. Our residents, it's sometimes in affordable housing don't have a lot of choice, but they should have choice, just like a truly luxury housing that's out there where they've got the choice. And so we feel that it should be the same. And the only way to make that possibility is to tell our story and to tell the things that are going on, but to get those details out there so that they can hear the details that really matter. We want resident stability. You want asset preservation. You want long-term affordability and sustainability, because the outcomes that are created from that are better for our community and better for mankind, and it makes a difference in the community where the housing exists.
Glenda's answer seems to get right to the heart of why advocacy matters. If policymakers don't fully understand what's happening on the ground, it becomes much harder to create policies that actually work in practice. So I wanted to know from Larry's perspective, are there misconceptions in Washington about the operational realities of affordable housing? And what do lawmakers most often get wrong or simply not see?
Yeah, no, Glenda nailed it, and I echo everything she says 100%. And yeah, I mean the thing about lawmakers is they they really have short-term memory, and we need them to have a little bit of long-term memory. And their short-term memory is probably like the shortness of someone looking at their smartphone. So it's really rapid, and they're always responding to a crisis, and they're elected to do that. But what makes policy, unfortunately, is not the good that everybody does in our industry. It's really when it hits the headlines, bad property or unfortunate event of a fire. And then they're responding to that crisis, oftentimes what we call the bad apples, and that can anywhere. My estimate is somewhere less than 2% of the actors in this space, and then the 98% are not who the laws are written for, or they're not written off the lessons learned from those they're doing it well, like Glenda and others and SAHMA's network. But yeah, so what happens is really that we're often in this conversation of looking back, and really trying to, and it gets lost. the current needs, because Glenda hit off a lot of things that she's experiencing right now. When you talk about the inflationary pressures of expenses, keeping up with insurance, or the changing dynamics of the labor market, and who she's competing against in terms of retaining talent, or trying to acquire talent to help her do the work. So, and that's industry wide. So those are the realities, and lawmakers, while anyone's elected, they have a kind of a framework that they're operating from, or some things they're trying to do, but they've really based that off the 2 years that they spent running for office. And now they're in governing. Once you've sworn in and you get that 2 or 4 year term, depending, or 6 year, depending on if you're a senator, that's forward looking. And what are the challenges of the day? And oftentimes is we're fighting a battle of getting out their mind the past, or the events that may have led them to their respective positions and offices, to the current realities of what we're dealing with every day. And unfortunately, like I mentioned, laws don't keep up with time. We build on our work over years, sometimes unfortunately a decade, just to get to this point, just so we can get opportunity to work on the things that we're doing right now. So it's that cumulative effect that gets lost. So yeah, if we're not always pushing the message or reminding, our respective leaders, then they're just always looking back or responding to what got them there.
What Larry just described is a challenge that's probably not unique to affordable housing. Lawmakers have countless issues competing for their attention, and often it's the problems, controversies, or isolated incidents that rise to the surface. But if policymakers are only getting brief snapshots of the industry, and often only hearing about the less than 2% of situations where something has gone wrong, it seems reasonable to think that those headlines could shape not only policy discussions, but public perception as well. So I asked Larry how public perception of affordable housing has shifted over the years, and does he think some of the misconceptions we're seeing today stem from the fact that too many people are hearing the exceptions rather than the everyday success stories?
And that is a great question. I can tell you, just been in this job for a decade now. I think I'm counting it. It's evolved, but you're still battling. Like, it's battling this perception of what do we mean by affordable housing, right? Because most of the world hears government housing. They hear terms of subsidized housing, and then they have a negative connotation, and that leads to not in my backyard, or leads to people not being able to get the supply they need in their respective communities. And then we fought, really, probably I'd say over 2 decades of that fight, of really trying to change that image. A lot goes to the work that members do around whether communities equality, or just a lot of the preservation or the new construction that looks just like the market rate, and sometimes, in my opinion, better visually. And they see who's it serving, and then the good lessons that come out of it. To really, we're at that point. I think we're probably, if I was to give it a scale, we're probably like at 6 or 10, where we need to be to get the message out. Again, it's a testament that we're getting a lot of things moving legislatively. So people are clearly, and not to be a looser term, people are definitely interested in the product. Business speak, they're not saying they don't want to invest in the product. We have a very investable product, very investable story, and we have the impacts that it's making out in the world. So that's all good, but how does that world look if we're at a 9 or 10 out of 10, right? Where we're not having that local community resistance that shows up as traffic, really, if we're being honest, amongst the other things that is not being served. But if everybody's moving forward, if the local community's moving forward, and I share this, the best lawmakers I've ever seen work on housing, much like some of the most, best CEOs, they have an adjacent relationship with affordable housing, whether they grew up in it, so they don't have the negative connotation because it's their story, and they've seen, living on site, like, no. They hear him vocally pushing back, on some of the stereotypes and things. Or they may, volunteered or served on the board, or maybe a developer or something, and they came up through that path, but they have a very industry adjacent. So they understand the issue. Or I would say the other experience that I've seen is if a crisis hits, unfortunately, and they're having to respond to it, and they get educated that manner. those lawmakers who've touched it, who've been on site and have that way to connect the stories, see beyond the line items, see beyond the legislative text, those are the ones who get our industry the best. And those are the easiest conversations because there's just a lot of nodding heads in there and they get it, versus, but that's not everybody, and our work has to continue to get at the everybody. And then the broader public perception is always ongoing.
Larry said that we're maybe a 6 out of 10 when it comes to public perception, and that people tend to better understand affordable housing when they can actually see it and experience it firsthand. I wanted to know if Glenda agreed with that assessment. So I asked her, from her perspective, how has public perception of affordable housing changed over the years?
I would say that that's probably a fair evaluation. While the perception of what the public has and the reality are often, they like the idea, they support it, but really understanding what it's all about, there's a little bit of disconnect there. I think it's better than what it used to be. Partially because I think it's more on the forefront of everyone's mind. It's touching people today because as we have more households that are cost burdened, that maybe it's never touched. And so I think from just the general public, maybe it's touching you or someone in your family, and that didn't happen before. And so it's, as Larry said, with the lawmakers, the more that they've either grown up or touched it, had some sort of adjacent thing. I think the same's true for the public. It's more and more people in your sphere that are being touched and impacted by it, but yet and still, we have a long way to go. When you look at those misconceptions, and Larry talked about a few of those, affordable housing, it lowers property values, but there's no evidence to show that where there's quality affordable housing, that it does that. So we're competing with those misconceptions. I mean, I just had a real world experience in a great city that has amazing housing where we wanted to add additional units, but it's not, it's kind of like Larry said, not in my backyard. We support it. We want to have this plan with the city that encompasses it, but yet we're building housing that is out of reach. And it's not out of reach for just those that you think about that are out of work, that are homeless. It's out of reach for teachers, for professionals that are our firefighters, that are our policemen, that are all those things. And so it's really touching and impacting people that can't live in the community, and those services are things that are needed. And so those misconceptions, a lot of times the conception is, oh, none of the residents in affordable housing work, they all don't have a job. That's not reality. The reality is maybe those are the 2%. And even those that don't have jobs, sometimes it's not because they don't want to. If they have children, just the cost of childcare, they can't make enough to pay that and pay for housing. And so decisions are having to be made that are difficult decisions that you're looking at. I mean, our residents too. I have seniors that, oftentimes are having to make the decisions, am I going to have medical care versus am I going to pay for housing, or am I going to eat, and those kind of things. And so I think those misconceptions of who those people are and what they did to get there are just not reality. And so as the public understands more of those things, then I think we have a long way to get so that we're at that 9 or 10 level. And when you have really the understanding of what it's about, I think you come together and look at policy different and say, okay, these are real issues that, good working people that want to better themselves have to deal with, that maybe if you are not in that world and don't live at it, don't realize how much of the population that it really impacts, and that those people that live there are not causing greater crime. That's not what they're about. Are there certain housing units maybe that do that? Yes, but those aren't the quality affordable housing that we're talking about. And those need to have perhaps a different focus and look at and need different operators. But most of your operators that I deal with and your residents are not those misconceptions that exist within the public.
What I heard in Glenda's answer is that affordable housing isn't some abstract policy issue. It's teachers, first responders, and working families who can't afford to live in the communities they serve. It's seniors trying to balance the cost of housing with healthcare and other basic needs. And it's residents who are often defined by stereotypes rather than by who they really are. That brings me to something I wanted to get both of their perspectives on. When they hear some of the misconceptions about affordable housing or about the people who live in affordable housing communities, what frustrates them the most? What do they wish the public better understood about the residents, the properties, and the role affordable housing plays in our communities?
I would probably record a whole different podcast on my frustrations. So I'll give you my lived experience. I'm in Arlington, right outside of DC, and they just it's the most ridiculous community. We've had Amazon come in. We had a lot of other defense contractors come in over the last few years, and the housing supply did not match our labor market. It doesn't match our labor market. You really have a more or less a higher income labor market on this side of DC, but the places that people want to go, restaurants, retail, etc., school systems, everything else, those workers that work there are being priced out of the county, largely based on the supply that's coming in to respond to the, yeah, I'm all for Amazon coming in and bringing jobs if they join that. But, the labor market challenge, it really pushed prices people out. So then you see ballot initiatives come up recently, and they're voted down just to whether it's the locality trying to set up a fund for more affordable housing, or even just changing the density units to build up. Because
Right.
we don't have much more land, not getting more land, so we really need to build up. And the single family community pushes back on that. And then the number one thing everybody complains about is traffic, or are various services declining. And I'm like, well, workers are really getting pushed out. So you see neighboring counties trying to, and they're battling to absorb it. So it's just this trickle down effect, of people pushing out. And it doesn't make any sense to be sustainable strategically over time. You need a comprehensive look at your supply. You need a comprehensive look at the population you're serving, and you need them to match and move in the same direction, because any misdirection of that is going to create problems somewhere else, and you're not going to solve it. And then, or up here, we have a very, very, like, it's like institutionalized. Oh, it's just somebody else's problem, and think about our work. We're that close to all the lawmakers. We're right next door. I can throw a rock and hit the White House, and this is discussion here. So think about it around the country, and in terms of proximity and how it plays out. And I just that's kind of I'll get off my tangent off that.
I'm just going to jump on. Larry stole my thunder. I was going to say the biggest thing is someone else's problem. In reality, affordable housing supports the local workforce and the economic stability, which is what Larry's talking about. You can't have those things. It's great that you have wonderful communities. That's what we want across America. America is a land of opportunity, and we want that to be opportunity for everyone. But when you look at that, it's like even building it, and just because we build multifamily, your foundation is critical. You've got to have a foundation there. And so what we want to do, and when they're looking at it from a policy perspective and looking at things, it's like, okay, we're not looking at the foundation and how those two match up. And so if you don't have a strong foundation and a workforce that can support that economic stability for those items that are needed and that people are looking for, when they want to move into neighborhoods, they want strong education, they want quality education, they want quality health care, they want, a safe community. All those things are built on foundation of people who are really being, you know, not affordable. Housing is not affordable for those people in those professions. And so how do you address that? And you can't address it just in looking at housing. You've got to looking at policy all the way around. And so that's one of the things that I really wish that policy makers could take a look at is let's look at housing, but how that supports our health system, how that supports our education system. Let's look at all those programs. We quite often say, okay, it's difficult. Affordable housing is difficult. But if I could take a sector of those and figure those out and put those within my housing, one of the things that we just recently tried to actually had a contract with a company to do, because in our housing, quite often our seniors can't afford transportation or those other things. If we could bring that health care into the building and contract with someone, but they said, we can't, it doesn't make sense for us. We can't do that. So they pulled out of the contract that we were going to have that was going to help and provide the support that they need. So, you hear not just affordable housing, you hear Medicaid, you hear Medicare, you hear education and, funding for that. that. We really need to look at all that. And it all comes down, if you don't have secure, stable home environment, none of those things are going to work. And all of those other things are going to be more costly, and they're going to be impacted by that. So you might be able to drive down the cost of some of those other things if we really looked at comprehensive programs, but they're all tied to a secure home environment. And that's what I often tell, our employees is the difference is we're not just building buildings out there, and we're not just managing buildings. You're dealing with people's lives. And so that's what I think is when we always say it's someone else's problem, it's not. It's all of our problem. And it starts though with that stable housing so that we can then look at those other impacts and how we can integrate those things together.
What's striking about both Glenda and Larry's answers is that they're really talking about housing as a foundation. It's not just about having a roof overhead. Housing affects a person's ability to keep a job, succeed in school, access healthcare, and build stability for themselves and their families. I loved Glenda's phrase, "We're not just building buildings, we're dealing with lives." And Larry spends a lot of time taking the affordable housing story to lawmakers. So I wondered, when they hear these real world stories about working families, seniors, teachers, first responders, and the lives being impacted every day, does it resonate? Do those human stories break through in a way that statistics and policy briefs sometimes can't?
Absolutely. And, anytime you encompass the lived experience, the humanity side of it, it lands. I would tell, most people who come to DC, try to educate them on like, it's really a dual job when you go to a lawmaker's office. One is to get your story out there, but the other part of it is who you're telling your story to. And most people have a misconception they're going to spend time with a lawmaker or senator. Really, in reality, you're probably spending time with someone between the age of 20 to 26.
Yeah.
And it's their first time experiencing with this matter. So it's really educational. And then I try to do my best, and I'm learning and always trying to perfect my craft. It's like try to remove all the language out of it regarding the policy and just really get down to the nuts and bolts. This is what I do every day, and this is who it impacts, and this is who I serve, and here's where we're located, in a specific state or district, and really try to have that human element of it, because I think that's what sticks. And when as Glenda was telling the story there of the senior and her service, I'm over here getting mad because I'm gonna call her after this about who did that, basically, and but that is what sticks. That's what resonates is to your point, that human element of it. And yeah, our job is to make it hard to look the other way. And let's be honest, and and when we leave a story with anyone, we want to leave it, with that managed. I want you to understand this resonates, so you just can't look the other way and move on to the next issue. So.
I wrote down something Larry just said because I think it's incredibly powerful. He said, "Our job is to make it hard for lawmakers to look the other way." When people hear the word advocacy, they often think it's something reserved for executives, association leaders, or government affairs professionals. But affordable housing is really powered by people at every level, from property managers and maintenance technicians to leasing staff and resident service coordinators. Why is it important for those frontline professionals to participate in advocacy efforts as well? And what unique perspective do they bring to the conversation that lawmakers might not hear otherwise?
Yeah, no, great question. One, I would tell you, if you're not in the room or you're not telling your story, someone else is telling it for you. You alluded to your introduction, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, whether Glenda touch up on a few points, oftentimes what we see the president in DC is obviously the tenants. They're more, and that's not to say they're telling a bad story or anything, right, but they're telling their story, right? That's their experience with living in communities. And like say, not everybody's going to live in a great community. Mm-hmm. Not everybody's going to come to DC to tell that great story. So the story that gets told is the one by the tenants' lived experience, and that's around the country, right? The other side of it is oftentimes the capital stack, comes to town because they need the dollars to continue building and developing. So they're always here, right? And they're going to tell their story about why they, need additional dollars or financing tools to build. And then what's the void is the operational challenge that Glenda highlighted. They're there today, and that's every member of their team, whether it's maintenance, whether it's frontline staff, whether it's the resident service coordinator, they all have a unique story. And, it's always a constant of like, just other last week there was a banking committee staff for just at a forum. We were just at an event, and they just want they feel bad because they don't know the basics, right? And it's like, they catch someone like me. It's like, just tell me what does this mean? What does insurance cost mean for your members or whatever? And it's like, but that experience, can only come from a membership perspective about the challenge they're experiencing. And it's going to vary around the country, right? Our West Coast colleagues have a different story. Our New England and Northeast colleagues and Midwest colleagues, they all have different stories, but it requires all of us to go as a comprehensive to be going to share our own stories. So they're at least left with from hearing from us, they're not getting it from another party.
Throughout this conversation, we've talked about the importance of advocacy, the misconceptions surrounding affordable housing, and the need for lawmakers to understand what's actually happening on the ground. So I wanted to ask them both the big question. If we're not on the front lines telling the affordable housing story, someone else will be. What do we risk losing if property management professionals stop sharing their experiences, their challenges, and the stories of the residents they serve?
I'll let you.
Okay. Well, if you stop talking, then someone else is sharing the story. So they're getting maybe not the true story as we talked about. So you're going to have, less understanding that's going to be there. Policies are going to be created that really don't line up from an operational or maybe even an impact that impacts the resident's life. So it is important that we are telling the story so that we can translate that policy into real life consequences for our staff, for our residents, for those that are really working within the industry so that those things line up. That we talked about a lot of things. We talked about compliance and the details and the complexity of the funding and all those things. But there's much more that's involved as far as resident needs and building systems and regulatory requirements. Our staff is trying to manage and triage those priorities and what they are. Well, if they're not telling those story, then you're not hearing those things. They don't know how those things are really lining up in people's life. And it's like Larry, we was talking about the need to get people out. And oftentimes it is a constant educational process because it's not, your senior lawmakers are so busy dealing with so many priorities. They oftentimes don't have the time to come out maybe to your property and to meet those residents and to hear those stories and to hear the impact that they're making on people's lives, really making a difference. I can't tell you how many stories that I have from residents who tear up that say they are so thankful for what they have. And people don't hear those stories. They think they're taking advantage. They're just trying to beat the system and do this. But these are hardworking people that really made a difference. And hearing one of those stories really helps you resonate and say, okay, what did we do right that enabled us to provide these housing for them, and how can we continue that? And then talking to those maybe 15 that are on the wait list that are, some living in their cars, some living with family members, whatever those situations might be, just trying to make it meet because there's insufficient supply that are out there. Really realizing, how did you get into this situation? And hearing the stories even of those that have come into the units and what their process was to get there because of the lack of that supply. But since they've been there, the difference that it made in their life. Just one brief story about a resident, and this is a senior resident that came into one of our properties. And so when he was on the wait list and came in, the staff noticed that it was really offensive, his smell. I mean, because he had been homeless forever and everything like that. And so, but we treat everyone equally, regardless of what that is. But he was able to get housed and had no furnishings or things like that he brought. So he's sleeping on the floor. I mean, these are real life stories of people that come in. But the next day after he was able to come in, he came down with tears in his eyes and he said, I am so thankful to you guys because I was able to get a housing unit. I haven't had a bath, and I forget the number of days in so long because he had lived in homeless shelters. And if he went to take a bath, everything he had, which was not much, would be stolen by others that were in there. So it's oftentimes not understanding. It wasn't because he didn't want to, but because of the protective measures that he had to put in place. And I think understanding those real life dynamics of the people and the situations, which oftentimes judgment is just there and like, oh, well, they just don't care. And, they're not, that's not oftentimes what it is. But even once you get people into housing, it's understanding oftentimes, I mean, since COVID, it seems like in our entire environment, there's a lot of people are now emphasizing, mental health and the stability of that and the service coordinators and the services that are needed to help people transition into those things. And I think oftentimes that's overlooked as well. And so we don't have the resources when you're talking about an operational budget to supply that. But it's like I said, it's comprehensive, not just looking at putting them in a unit, but looking at those comprehensive services that may be needed to make sure that once they're in the unit, they're able to stay in the unit and really operate in a community that is a thriving community. And that's one of the things that we have our staff focus on and that they get the most joy from is really making a difference in the life of those people and then telling those stories. But oftentimes, as you said, the maintenance, maybe they don't want to speak out because maybe they're a little bit more timid, but it's not like you've got to go and make this grandiose argument before the legislators on the Hill. Just tell the real life stories of the people that you're in the unit and what they shared with you and what you're able to share and the fact that you actually care and will see that their unit, their faucets are not falling apart and that they turn on and off and, just simple things like that. It's sharing those simple things that truly make a difference. And that if they hear those things and the need to educate on those things because those positions turn over constantly. And so it's that constant advocacy that's needed and that constant education. We often to our events invite our congressmen, our senators, those are not the people that typically show up. It's going to be a representative of their staff. So it's educating that staff and telling a story that makes a difference because they're not going to remember maybe the detailed policies that are there, but they're going to remember that story. And if it's significant enough, they're going to go back and share it before the legislator so that hopefully they're then going to want to inquire more and we can get down into more of the details and the higher level things that really need to be looked at from a policy level perspective.
I bet you could hear the passion in Glenda's voice. And I think she made a compelling case that every one of us has a role to play in telling the affordable housing story. But I also know that there might be some listeners who might be thinking, okay, I'm convinced, but what does advocacy actually look like for me? So I asked Larry to make this practical. When people hear advocacy, they often picture getting on a plane to Washington, D.C., putting on their best suit and walking the halls of Capitol Hill. Is that what we're talking about? What does advocacy actually look like for the average affordable housing professional who wants to make a difference?
No, actually, it's not. I think the flight to DC, I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, maybe the least effective thing you can do. Because you're here with all other interests, to be honest with you. But it also takes you away from your superpower. And I remember superpower, which is the sites and the tenants and the job that they're doing out in the districts or out in the states. So actually, it's the reverse. I would say is to get the biggest thing you can do is to showcase your work, right? That's either going to whether a local lawmaker's office, they have district offices around the state or around their respective district where they have staff that are there in state in an area that are easily to be the most knowledgeable on behalf of the lawmaker of their respective jurisdiction that they're covering. So getting to know them, sharing your story with them. The advent of technology has really broken down the barrier of how we can do this and how we can reach out to lawmakers, whether you're talking about social media. Just my easiest thing is to everyone that has a smartphone, a 30-second to minute video. Hey, this is where I live. I love my place. I love what I do. My framework is really simple. 3 Ps: people, place, purpose. If you want to tell the people story, is whether you as the staff and the work that you do or the resident who's being served, that's the people side. The place is the property. This is where we're at. This is where we're located. This is how many units. This is respective programs. If you know that, or if not, go grab a friend who may know that, and you guys both record or share the message at the same time. And then the purpose, right? This is why Glenda's touching on the life outcomes, why we do this business, the human element of it all and why it matters and who we're serving. And this is how we serve them. And this is our why, right? So if you do the 3 Ps, people, place, purpose, then you can take that message to the locality, take it to a town hall. If the senators, a lot of lawmakers in election years love to get on site. So if they have interest in getting on property sites, a round table where you have staff or tenants, or maybe just make a day out of it. Lawmakers love ribbon cuttings. That's the easiest thing, right? Anytime you get a grant or some type of ribbon cutting for new construction or preservation, they typically come out, or at least a representative to connect that story. And then if you do all that at the local level, then if you're a Glenda or you're a member of NAHMA, you come up to DC and we try to connect the roundtable it out to we'll have we need to do more on these particular 3-4 items that may be in front of lawmakers at the time, or we're trying to get them in front of lawmakers over time. But the most impactful stories are the local ones, those told through local actors that live there day in and day out, that do the work, and they matter the most. And that's where I've seen that nails in. And low-income housing tax credit is probably the best example of that, because it doesn't get as much support the way it has now. It's probably next to business tax credit, the most supported item in Congress. Both Republican and Democrats love it. And that's largely it's the private sector. So it's only so much. It's a tax incentive. It can marry with other dollars, other public dollars, whether rental assistance or et cetera. But the partnership that has to come together to make a LIHTC deal work between the state, between the local government, between the federal government, and then the private sector or the nonprofit, if you're a nonprofit in that element, mission-based, and all of that has to come together to make a deal work and to make it properly operational. So that is, just people, place, purpose.
I loved the 3 Ps, people, place, and purpose, because they really feel like the thread that's run throughout this entire conversation. We've talked about legislation and regulations, but we've also talked about teachers, first responders, seniors, and families. We've talked about communities, and we've talked about the responsibility all of us have to help tell this story. Before we wrapped it up, I wanted to give both Glenda and Larry the last word. What's one thing they hoped our listeners remember after hearing this conversation today?
I would just say one thing is, it's like you said, it is an important part of our work. And part of the problem when you're boots on the ground, from the staff, property management staff particularly, is you have so many different things directions that you're pulled in. And so oftentimes it's not that you don't think that advocacy is important, but you get lost in the daily details of the compliance, of dealing with, resident needs, of building systems and things that need to happen. So again, it's understanding just from a leadership perspective that, that advocacy is important. And oftentimes one of the things that we look at is the urgent things are what pull you away and take your time. But it's important that we consider those important things, not only the urgent things. And so I think advocacy is important, because if we don't take it into our own hands to do that, that narrative is going to be created by others, and it's not going to have the impact that we want to on the people, as Larry said. Everyone that's in affordable housing is there for the purpose of making a difference. That's how we're able to attract staff in a competitive world. And so in order to do that, I think as we educate our, employees, as we educate our staff, as we educate our leadership, that it's important for you to have the impact that you want on those people, and for that purpose to really make a difference. Advocacy has to be an important part of what you're doing.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the SAHMA Exchange, a podcast where policy, people, and property management meet. A big thank you to Larry Keyes, Vice President of Government Affairs at NAHMA, and Glenda Leduc, President of Mansermar and Mid-America Apartment Management Company, for sharing their insights and reminding us why advocacy matters. Whether you're a property manager, maintenance technician, resident services coordinator, executive, or industry partner, your voice matters. The future of affordable housing depends on the stories we tell and the relationships we build. Until next time, keep advocating, keep educating, and keep making a difference in the communities you serve.